You ever wonder why we're here? It's one of life's great mysteries, isn't it?
August 22nd, 1985. British Air Tours Flight 28M, a Boeing 737 with 137 people on board, is about to embark on a charter flight from Manchester, England to Corfu, Greece. During the takeoff roll, while accelerating through approximately 125 knots, the pilots hear a loud bang, and, assuming that one of their tires has popped, they begin aborting the takeoff. The first officer applies the brakes and the plane slows down and then exits onto a taxiway. 9 seconds after hearing the bang, fire alarms begin sounding in the cockpit. The tower controller then confirms, "Right, there's a lot of fire," and suggests that the pilots evacuate passengers out of the right side of the plane. The pilots begin their 15-step checklist, of which evacuating passengers is the last item. A fire is now raging in the plane and smoke is filling the cabin. When all is said and done, 55 people have died in an accident where the plane never even left the ground. Why did so many people die in this accident? And what changes have been implemented to make evacuating a plane safer? Find out on this episode of Black Box Down. Hello everyone, welcome to Black Box Down. It's Gus and Chris. Hello, Chris.
Hi.
I heard a gasp during the intro there from you.
That's a lot of items on a checklist where getting people out of the fire is surprisingly lower on the list.
Well, we're obviously going to get into it, but if you think about it, there are certain things that have to be done before you can evacuate the passengers, like turning the engines off.
Yeah.
So that people don't walk in front and, get injured. But
I want to see the other 14.
What's going on here? Well, even just, it's not like, turn the engine off, right? There's steps to everything.
Sure.
So it's going to take a little while, and we're going to get into it. No spoiler here. I think this is our longest script ever for Black Box Down.
Oh my goodness.
It's really long. For a plane that never got off the ground.
There better be some juice in this fruit, because
there's a lot to break down here. Before we get into it, of course, give us a follow on social media at Black Box Down Pod on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. There's definitely some pictures I want to share about this one to help show what happened and, give you a further explanation. I'll do my best here in the audio, but it doesn't hurt to check out social media. So British Air Tours 28M, this was, like I said, this was a charter flight, and British Air Tours was the low-cost branch of British Airways. It was kind of a tour group, right? Like tour packages kind of thing, like all-inclusive tours.
Okay.
And this was the summer, they were doing a flight.
This is the 80s too, where I feel like that thing is more common, where there'd be like tours and travel planner type things.
It was before you could book things on the internet, right?
Yeah.
You go to like a travel agent and they'd be like, you tell them you want to go to Greece and they'd book the flight and the hotel and everything just all in one package. And just kind of, that was what you did. And it was the summertime, August. So probably a lot of people going down to Greece for holiday.
That's cool. I bet they had some good little trips. Everyone you fly with is also
they're going on vacation.
Going to the same places you can make friends.
Yeah. So British Air Tours specifically was established in 1969 and became a subsidiary of British Airways in the early 70s. And then it adopted the name Caledonian Airways in 1988. This is after the accident. And then got sold to a tour operator called Inspirations in 1995 when British Airways exited the inclusive tour market. I think just in general, that was changing. Like we just talked about, the internet was starting to take off. People were maybe booking directly. 1995 is still pretty early for internet stuff, but maybe British Airways saw the writing on the wall and just got out of that market.
Yeah.
Anyway, in 1999, Thomas Cook acquired Inspirations and then merged Caledonian Airways with Flying Colors to form a company called JMC Air Services, which became Thomas Cook Airlines. Now, here in the United States, we're not very familiar with Thomas Cook, but this was a huge tour operator based out of the United Kingdom, like absolutely massive. And Thomas Cook actually very famously ceased operations in September of 2019.
Oh,
I don't know if you kept up with the news when that happened.
Well, not British tour company news, but
well, I think this was
bigger. Yeah,
this was huge news worldwide because they kind of collapsed without warning. Like people were out on holiday. They stranded 165,000 passengers around the world. When they went under, and other airlines from all around the world had to step in and help get these 165,000 people back to the United Kingdom.
In what year? When? 2000?
September 2019.
This is before COVID.
Right before COVID, yeah.
Wow.
So people were traveling everywhere. We could do a whole, this isn't the core of our podcast, but we could do like a whole supplemental episode just about the rise and fall of Thomas Cook Airlines and what a big deal this was when essentially they went out of business overnight without warning. Imagine you're out on a trip and then all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah.
I can't check into my flight.
Yeah. Not only can you not check into your flight, that flight's
doesn't exist.
Isn't going to fly.
Can't check into my flight. I'll check the website. The website's not working. I'll call. What do you mean the airline doesn't exist?
Right. So this was a big deal when this happened.
The Thomas Cook affair.
Yeah. Nice. Anyway, I just wanted to give a little bit of background as to what happened with British Air Tours, because I was not familiar with British Air Tours. Anyway, back to this specific accident we're talking about. The flight was captained by Peter Tarrington, who was 39 years old, and First Officer Brian Love, who was 52 years old. The captain had 8,441 flight hours, and the first officer had 12,277 flight hours, of which the captain had 1,276 hours in the Boeing 737, and the first officer had 345. So even though the first officer was older and had more hours, he had less time in Boeing 737s than the captain did. And the aircraft was powered by two Pratt & Whitney JT8D engines that seemed to be operating fine, or I should say they at least powered up without incident. However, that being said, there was an entry in the technical log that had been entered on the previous day that complained that there was slow acceleration in the number one engine, which is the left-hand side. And the pilots discuss it because the first officer had actually been a member of the crew on that flight when there was slow acceleration in the number one engine. But there had been no reported problems on the two flights after some remedial action had been carried out. So the captain just, signed his acceptance of that log. The aircraft was cleared to line up on runway 24. And since nose wheel steering was only available through a tiller on the left side of the flight deck, the first officer assumed control after the commander had lined up the aircraft on the runway. And we've talked about this before. Sometimes on planes, you can only steer the nose wheel from one side of the plane.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So in this case, the nose steering wheel, you can think of it that way, was only on the captain's side. So he lined the plane up, and then, it was the first officer's plane to fly. And, they could also do a limited amount of steering through the rudder pedals as well. But really, the bulk of the steering was from that tiller wheel, or I should say the tiller. The aircraft was cleared for takeoff at 6:12 a.m. Universal Time, which was 7:12 a.m. local time.
Okay. Early morning
Flight. Go on holiday.
Yeah.
Get an early start on it.
We're going to get this vacation started off with a bang.
No.
Oh.
So the wind was reported at 250 at 7 knots. So light wind, pretty close to straight down the runway, just 10 degrees off.
Mm-hmm.
And the first officer requested takeoff power. The commander advanced the throttles and commented that the number one engine acceleration was acceptable. The first officer agreed that it was better than on the previous day. And then the auto throttle was selected and the engines achieved required takeoff power.
So they were having issues with it?
The day before, number one engine had been slow to accelerate. And the first officer had been on that flight and they'd noted it. Some remedial action was done and it seemed to be better. That's why the first officer says it was better than the day before when he saw it last. And then while they're, accelerating down the runway, the captain makes a routine call of 80 knots, which was confirmed by the first officer. And then 12 seconds later, a thump was heard. Immediately, the commander ordered stop, and he closed the throttles and selected reverse thrust on both engines.
How fast were they going at that point?
At that point, about 125 knots.
Okay, so they were close to V1.
Yeah,
right?
they were getting close to the point of no return.
Yeah.
But, they managed to stop before they reached that point. They still had enough runway ahead of them. So it's like, okay. And then that's what happens. The captain says stop, turns the throttles off, turns the thrust reversers on, checks that the speed brakes are extended. The maximum indicated airspeed achieved was 126 knots. And they thought that either maybe a tire had burst or they'd hit a bird.
Bird? A big bird.
You never know if the bird gets ingested into the engine. It might make like a loud thumping sound. Or I guess even if it hits up near the cockpit. But so whatever, they know, hey,
something.
That's not a good sound, not a normal sound.
Yeah.
So they initiate the stop. And both thrust reverser systems deployed, and the right engine pressure ratio peaked briefly at 1.32 before settling at 1.25 for about 5 seconds, after which reverse was deselected on both engines. So they deploy the thrust reversers, then retract them when they get down to about 70 knots. However, when they did that, only the right engine reverser retracted.
So it wouldn't retract?
The left engine one would not retract. The thrust reverser deployed, but then stayed deployed.
Oh.
And also, the left engine EPR fell to 0. Remember, I said the right engine was at 1.25. The left engine fell to 0 within 2 seconds of the thud and then remained at 0.
Revolutions per
EPR, it's the engine pressure ratio. It's just a measurement of
fuel to air.
Well, like the power that it's putting out.
I'll stop trying to guess it.
Well, it fell to 0. And I only point that out because the right engine still has power in it. If it falls to 0, it's like it's off.
Yeah, but probably just the fire burned through some electronics.
Well, at this point, they don't know there's a fire, but presumably right. The engine has failed or something's gone wrong with it. So the engine fell to 0 and stayed at 0. and the high pressure spool speed decayed more gradually, so it's like winding down, with the result that the thrust reverser buckets on the left engine were able to deploy fully. However, by the time they tried to retract them, the speed had decayed to a point and the engine oil pressure had fallen to where the thrust reverser was stuck open.
Yeah, it didn't have power to...
Right. There was no go juice to close it. So that bucket just stayed fully extended. The first officer had applied maximum wheel braking, but since the captain thought that maybe the thud was a tire failure, and they had plenty of runway in front of them, he's recorded as saying, "Don't hammer the brakes, don't hammer the brakes." And the first officer responds by modulating the braking effort. He's like not jamming on them. There's no need to like stomp on them.
Yeah.
Especially if there's a tire that's blown, it could cause things to become
more damage, like that could mess up the brakes. Or
right.
Yeah.
Or even like if you're in a car and you have a blowout, you don't slam on the brakes. You kind of like let it like decelerate on its own. You don't want to potentially have it go off to one side. So what had happened here actually, they don't know it at this point, but the left engine had suffered an uncontained failure, which punctured a wing fuel tank access panel. Uncontained failure. That just means that the engine failed and then a part of it shot out.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. If that's what you meant by uncontained.
Yeah, so it failed and then a part of it exited. Exited out of the engine, punctured the wing fuel tank access panel, and then fuel leaking from the wing ignited and burned as a large plume of fire trailing directly behind the engine. So the thud they heard was probably the engine failure and then a part of the engine coming out and hitting the wing.
And then
which punctured the fuel tank, spilled fuel. And we talked about this at another incident where there was a slow leak in the fuel tank, and as long as the engine was on and they were taxiing, the fuel was getting pushed away from the engine. But then the second they stopped to shut down the engine, then the fuel hit the engine directly and ignited. So not quite exactly the same, but similar. At 45 seconds after the start of the takeoff run, which was 9 seconds after the thud, the aircraft was decelerating through 85 knots of ground speed. The commander started to inform air traffic control that they were abandoning the takeoff. And it was right at this time that the fire bell on the flight deck started ringing right at the start of this transmission. And he added, as he canceled reverse thrust, "It looks as though we've got a fire on number one." Then there was a 3-second pause, 19 seconds after the thud, and before the crew had silenced that fire bell, air traffic control transmitted, "There's a lot of fire. They're on their way now."
Oh, so it's like looks like we got a fire. They were processing in that 3 seconds, I guess.
Well, the pilots say it looks like we've got a fire number one. Then the tower tells them,
there's in 3 seconds. Yeah.
Like, hey, there's a lot of fire. Then right at the end of that transmission, the fire bell was inhibited and the ground speed was reduced to below 50 knots. And the commander queried with air traffic control whether he needed to evacuate the passengers. And the controller replied, "I would do via the starboard side." Because remember, their left engine's on fire. So air traffic control is telling them, hey, exit your passengers out the right side, away from the fire. This message was passed 25 seconds after the thud and 20 seconds before the aircraft stopped as it decelerated through 36 knots of ground speed. So they're still rolling. They're still going for 36 knots. That's probably around 40 miles an hour, just over 60 kilometers an hour. So they're still rolling at a pretty decent clip.
Yeah.
And they're figuring out they're on fire and they need to evacuate everyone out of the right side, but they can't do it yet because they're still moving. Some 6 seconds later, 14 seconds before the aircraft stopped, as the commander initiated a turn into Link Delta, so he's turning off the runway onto the taxiway.
Okay. Would it have been better for him to stop where he was? I guess it would have held up a lot of stuff because it's on the runway, but...
Right, but what are the advantages versus the taxiway? Well, that's a good question. I'm going to put a pin in that.
Okay.
We're going to talk about that in a second. So, like I said, 6 seconds later, 14 seconds before the aircraft stopped, the commander started that turn, and he warned the crew of an evacuation from the right side of the aircraft by making a broadcast over the PA system, saying, "Evacuate on the starboard side, please." As the aircraft's ground speed reduced through 17 knots, 10 seconds before they stopped, the purser, which is like the lead flight attendant, opened the flight deck door and said, "Say again," trying to confirm the evacuation order. And the commander repeated, "Evacuate on the starboard side." This is still 8 seconds before they come to a halt. Immediately, when the aircraft stopped, the commander ordered the engine fire drill to be carried out on the left engine by the first officer, and as the passenger evacuation was to be carried out on the right-hand side to also shut down the right engine. So they come to a stop, and they're like, hey, we need to do the fire drill on the left engine, and we also need to shut down the right engine because passengers are going to be going out on the right side. So you see, there's a lot now that needs to be done in order to even get people out the door.
Yeah.
And the passenger evacuation drill, it's what they call a non-memory drill. So they have to, pull out the checklist and run through it.
Okay.
It was called for by the commander and was read from the quick reference handbook by the first officer. But before they were able to complete the drill, the commander saw fuel and fire spreading forward on the left side of the aircraft. So, they're running the checklist, and the captain looks out and he sees, the fire's advancing. It's coming up the left side of the plane.
Yeah.
So he opens the co-pilot's sliding window on the right side of the flight deck and ordered the first officer to evacuate the aircraft. Man, we've talked about this before as well. There are ropes and plastic, or I should say fabric escape straps above the sliding windows in the cockpit. So he told the first officer, go out the window, here. Don't even go to the door.
You go out here from the cockpit and don't. Wow.
And the first officer did so.
He's just like, bye.
Yeah. Goes out the sliding window, and then he was followed down to the ground by the commander.
But wait, what about the checklist?
They got as far as they could, but at that point, they knew it was too dangerous. They needed to go.
And then they just...
But they'd already ordered the evacuation by this point.
Okay, and they're not in charge of the evacuation. That's what the crew is for. Right. I guess I'm thinking and this is not the correct way of thinking, the captain goes down with the ship kind of thing, like the last one off,
And we've talked about incidents like that where, the pilots don't leave and they go back in and check. I think that they saw the fire advancing so quickly and, they'd already communicated. The purser had come in. They'd already directly communicated with them to evacuate everyone.
Yeah.
And I think they just, needed to get out of there.
Yeah.
So you asked about, a little while ago, staying on the runway versus exiting onto the taxiway. And I'm just curious, why did you ask that? Is it about like a matter of what's faster?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One, it's like in a situation where there's a fire rapidly advancing, time is one element, right? Like how quickly can they stop and get everyone out? But then there's also, is emergency vehicles and stuff easier to access the taxiway versus the runway? Or also, if they stayed on the runway, would that create problems for other planes trying to land and take off? Could there be,
what are the
other issues? Yeah.
I think, in an emergency, they're not going to care about the other planes. That's someone else's problem. They need to deal with their emergency. As far as fire crews, I think they can get to the taxiway and the runway pretty much the same. But what you didn't say right now is the same thing that the pilots didn't consider. And that's not damning on them. That's just, in general, this was a side effect that was not considered before this accident. Like I was saying, the aircraft was taking off on runway 24, and the wind was almost straight down the runway. When they turned to the right, since the fire was on their left side, the wind pushed the fire straight into the fuselage of the plane.
Oh.
So when they turned off, the wind was about 7 knots from 250. It carried the fire onto and around the rear fuselage. If they'd made a left turn, I don't think there were left taxiways, so it would have been impossible. I'd have to double check that. If they'd made a left turn, the fire would have been blown away from the plane. But since they turned right, the wind hit the fire and then just made it engulf the back of the plane.
That was the other thing I was thinking. I didn't think about. Let me say this: I didn't think about the direction of the wind, but I was also thinking the more they move, the more oxygen is just going to get to the fire. Like that when we were like, how long are they going to dry or dry? Like they're just pushing oxygen. I didn't think about the wind direction though, but also I don't know who would.
Right. It's something that was very overlooked at the time. No one would have thought about it.
Yeah, unless you dealt with fires on planes before and you're like, that's your thing.
Right.
In which case, that sucks.
Yeah, this is awful. So they turned to the right, which was the worst possible direction to turn. And then as they stopped, the hull was penetrated rapidly by smoke and some flames. And they entered the cabin through the aft right door, which was opened shortly before the aircraft came to a halt. And then subsequently, fire developed within the cabin. And despite the prompt attendance of the airport fire service, the plane was totally destroyed. And like we said in the intro, 55 people lost their life.
And 55 people is just because they couldn't get off the plane in time?
Well, that's the question, right?
Yeah.
What killed these people? Were they killed by the fire? Were they killed by smoke? Was it possible for them to have exited through a door? How much time are we talking about here? That's going to be, Chris, that's like the next 20 pages of this script is getting down into the nitty gritty about this and trying to figure out what went wrong and what can be done to prevent this. So in order to be certified during certification, planes must be evacuated within 90 seconds using only half their exits.
Oh, okay. This is in order to qualify, these are when your regulations when building a plane.
Right. When building a plane, when testing it before they come out, they have to prove you can evacuate that plane in 90 seconds using only half the exits.
I want to know how long it took them once they gave the evacuation to I guess they didn't finish.
No, well, and also, yeah, okay, yeah, you're right. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. but I am going to say something here to get a little ahead of myself, right? So these certification tests are done with no smoke, and the passengers know there's no risk to their life. And they are anticipating they're going to need to evacuate. So when they do these tests, it's like ideal situations.
Yeah.
It's clear. There's no real danger. Everyone's fine or lining up orderly and making their way to the exit.
Yeah.
But the reality, when things really go wrong, that's not the way it happens.
Yeah. I'm thinking about like, those are people who are hired to do drills.
Right. Yeah.
Like they're not even people doing drills who are just like, it's not like fire drills when you're in school.
Right.
Right. These are just, hey, we want to hire people to do some safety drill. Like,
it's really interesting because I watched some footage of these evacuation tests that they do, and they have everyone wear like a vest with their seat number on it, and then they watch, to see like how quickly each seat can get through the exits. So after this accident, their safety boards decided to kind of look at these tests and see what they could do to tweak them. So they had a psychologist come in to advise them about the way people are going to react and what's going to happen. So they came up with a special test to try to recreate the actual urgency that people would have.
Do they tell people they're doing one thing and then like surprise them with a fire test?
No, what they did was they offered people money based on how quickly they could get out of the plane.
Oh my
God. The
God.
faster you got out, the more money you got. So when they did the test like this, people were like crawling over seats and rushing and shoving to get ahead.
That's actually a really, I guess, smart way of like figuring out what people are actually going to do.
Right, because now they're incentivized to get out quickly. And there's no more orderly line.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, that really opened people's eyes. Like, oh, this is how people are actually going to evacuate a plane.
Yeah.
When there's an emergency.
And that's without the smoke and fire event.
Right.
Wow. It's like a game show. They should have felt that.
So, I mean, that's just before that's we haven't even gotten into the investigation here, but I just thought that was a really interesting part of an interesting lesson learned here. So, the investigation looked at the evacuation, and they said there was no delay in the response of the forward cabin crew members to the evacuation order. Indeed, it was the rapid operation of the R1 door. So the R1 door is, if you're sitting in the plane facing forward, it's at the very front on the right. Typically, you don't come in that door. It's like they'll load the galley through that door. It's like when you go up, if you go to the bathroom at the front of the plane, you look to the left, and that's the door you came in from. Then if you look to the right, there's another door there.
Yeah.
On the other side of the plane. That's the R1 door. So this report says it was the rapid operation of the R1 door with particular acceleration of the door through the aperture, which exposed the design fault associated with the release lanyard, leading to the premature release of the slide box, which caused the door to jam in the aperture.
It got jammed?
The R1 door, you're right, that they needed to evacuate from got jammed because they tried to open it so quickly that the slide started to deploy and then jammed the door in place.
That's a terrible design then. If the emergency door jams, if you try to open it too quickly.
Right. It's like, that shouldn't happen.
That's the only way you really open emergency things.
Right.
Under pressure.
So remember, there's a fire on the left side. They have to go out the right side, and the R1 door jams.
Oh my God. And that's the one at the front. That's the one that's furthest from the fire.
Correct.
That's the best door to leave.
That is the optimal door that they could leave from. And the aircraft manufacturer had no record of any similar occurrence during 20 years of experience of certification testing of the door with different slide designs or in any actual emergency evacuation.
Because they weren't paying people to get off.
But luckily for them, the purser, remember the flight attendant who had gone into the cockpit earlier, quickly decided not to spend any more time on the jammed door. So he then turned his attention.
It got jammed, like as in unopened. It's jammed.
It's just stuck.
Wow.
Right. So the purser realizes this and immediately decides, okay, we need to give up on this door and open the L1 door, which is the side with the fire, but it's at the very front of the plane, kind of away from the fire.
Furthest from the fire. Also, 2 doors is better than 1.
Right.
At that point.
So they turn to the L1 door. And
the other door, because there's 2 at the front and then 2 in the back.
Right. The L1 and R1 are at the very front. Then L2 and R2 are at the very back.
Okay.
We'll talk about those in just a bit. And then, of course, there's overwing exits as well. Emergency exit
3.
row.
So
there'd be a total of 6.
Yeah, sorry, 3 on each side. Yeah.
Right.
And then the cockpit slide away secret door.
Right, that only the pilots can use. So, like I said, the purser turns his attention from R1, knows it's not going to open, turns to L1, and opens up L1. And since he saw R1 jammed, he was very careful in opening L1 to make sure that it didn't jam as well. And he also, pulled the manual inflation handles for the slides, even though they were already deploying automatically. He just wanted to be sure that they deployed. Because we need to get people out this door.
Yeah. Okay.
So the overwing exits. The left overwing exit was blocked by smoke and flames. That's where the engine is. That's where the fuel tank is in the wing. This is going to be the worst point of fire.
In the middle of
Right,
the plane.
in the middle of the plane. This is not an exit you can use in this particular situation. So looking at the right overwing exit, the passenger who was seated at the right overwing exit had difficulty in understanding how to operate the hatch. At that time, there was no requirement that exit row passengers receive a briefing on how and when to open the hatch.
Wow. So this incident is why you have to verbally say, yes, I am capable and understand.
Yes. This is the reason.
Why weren't they able to open it? Were they just panicked, or
I think they were panicked and they'd probably never thought about it. They hadn't looked at the manual, right? And I think another thing that people don't think about with these emergency exits, I think about this just because I'm a weirdo.
Well, yeah, we also podcasts about it,
right? But the thing I think a lot of people don't think about is how heavy those hatches are. Have you ever thought about that? If you had to open that emergency exit door, how heavy? I
haven't thought about the weight of it, but they do emphasize are you I don't know, capable, physically capable. And so I've thought about well, there must be some physicality to it.
Mm-hmm. And lots of times the hatches do have their weight written on them. And this particular hatch was 22 kilograms, which is 48 pounds.
That's pretty heavy.
That's pretty heavy. So once, and we're talking about the right overwing exit. Once that hatch was released, it fell inward onto the passenger seated next to it, trapping her. So they open it. The door falls in. It falls on a passenger.
Wait, I thought they opened out.
There's different versions. And back then, in this one, it opened in. And then some of them.
We talked about an incident where the doors got shifted from inward to outward whenever one of the locks got messed up, right?
And that was a cargo door.
Cargo door.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But yeah, these they normally show you in the instructions whether the door you're seated in, if you're in an emergency exit, comes in or goes out. On this one, it comes in. And normally the instructions show you to, pull the hatch in and put it on the empty seats there in the exit row. In this case, the hatch came in and trapped a passenger. So then 2 passengers had to lift the hatch and put it in the seat in the next row back.
Wait, you say lift, is the door on hinges?
No.
Or does it just open
opens,
then it just
then you've got to deal with this thing.
Okay. I thought it was on hinges, and it opened and then.
I've seen some like that.
Okay.
I think the vast majority of them are not like that.
So it just pops open and then you just got, what do I do with this? And then people are pushing.
Right. People are pushing, trying to get out.
This is crazy.
And now you got to deal with
now you have a
50-pound hatch. You got to put it somewhere. It falls on a woman.
It's huge. And you're some woman, and you're and then you squish some woman under it.
And then she can't move, which creates another bottleneck for more people trying to get out.
Because everyone's pushing.
Right.
But when you pull the door, the balloon slides auto deploy, right? You said earlier?
Those are for the other ones. Overwing exits don't necessarily have a slide.
Wait. They don't necessarily have a slide?
Right, because remember, if you think about it, when you open those emergency overwing exits, the wing is right there. Where would the slide go?
So how are they getting out?
There's a few different ways. I don't know about this plane specifically, but normally you get out onto the wing and you either
climb onto the wing?
Right, yeah, there's a path. You can go out onto the wing and you go out onto the wing and go down to the ground. Or sometimes there's a little slide that will deploy there and then go down to the ground.
Okay. This is
awful.
Yeah.
So by the time they finally do this, they lift the hatch, they put on the next seat back. The exit is now available for use.
Mm-hmm.
This is 45 seconds after the plane has stopped. So the fire's already been going. The plane's been stopped for 45 seconds.
And they gave the order to evacuate before the plane had stopped.
Right.
Right before? 15? How long ago?
About, I think it was 6 seconds before they stopped.
Okay. That's actually, though, not that long.
But they need to be out in 90 seconds.
Yeah.
45 seconds has already been used.
Everyone is supposed to be out in 90 seconds. But I guess when you think about it, 45 seconds in your day, that's nothing.
Right. But when there's a fire.
No, I get, yeah. I'm just thinking about it. It's it's not like they were stuck there for 5 minutes. You know, it's 45 seconds to open is opening the door. It's every second counts.
Right. And that just means the exit's now available. No one's gotten out yet.
Yeah.
So once the hatch had been removed, there were still difficulties for passengers getting to and using the exit. The exit row seats only allowed 27 centimeters or 10.5 inches to pass through, and the armrest between those seats remained down.
Oh.
And the exit was directly over a seat. So it wasn't even it wasn't lined up with the aisle. You had to climb onto a seat to then get
No wonder that woman was trapped.
Right. This was just poorly laid out. So even though the door is now open, or I should say the exit is now open and available, it's not easy to get to because passengers have to maneuver awkwardly to escape. And like you said earlier, passengers in the rear of the aircraft are panicking because there's smoke and flames and the cabin is now getting really hot. all at the same time. So passengers are crawling over seat backs trying to get to this right overwing exit, as well as those 2 exits at the front.
What about the back exit? The back right one?
We'll get to that.
Or starboard?
Yeah, we're working our way back. And some survivors told investigators that the aisle had become blocked with bodies. So on top of that, like people are collapsing.
Bodies?
Right.
Like, not like bodies of like, I assume people were like, anytime you try and get off a plane, everyone stands up in the aisle.
Mm-hmm.
So I assume that was happening. But you're talking about people were passing out from the smoke inhalation.
Either passing out or dying at this point.
That they're dying that quickly from
smoke inhalation.
You can die that quickly from
Yes.
smoke? Wow.
Because remember, it's not necessarily just preventing you from breathing. It could be toxic fumes.
Yeah. Okay. Like,
if you think about all the stuff that's in a plane that's burning,
yeah,
like plastics and all those like awful chemicals that are being released that are getting into your lungs. So all of this caused jamming at all of the exits, and the seat over which the overwing exit was located failed in such a way that the seat back collapsed forward, causing a further obstruction.
Wait, what?
I think because people were trying to crawl over and get to the exit. Instead, normally you can recline the seat back.
It snapped.
It snapped
inward.
forward. Right.
Yeah. Which was where the hole for the door is.
Right.
So
we
now
just talked about it.
So now, oh my God.
It's becoming even more obstructed.
And it snapped. Oh my God. What did anyone even try and open the other door? Or was there too much fire and stuff?
On the left side, no. It was way too much fire.
Okay.
It would have been impossible. And a man who had been seated in 16C was found dead lying across that right overwing exit. And investigators are unsure whether the seat back collapse had trapped him, but they think it was a possibility.
Like he was trying to crawl through when it
collapsed
onto him,
right.
And then
he just got trapped.
And then people were
pushing, trying to get out.
And then people piled on top of him.
Right.
Like, because you always think about like how do people die in crowds?
Mm-hmm.
Like we're like, well, people are just standing. It's like, but people panic and then they trample.
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. And then it's like even one person would be a lot of weight to try to move. Now 2 people or 3 or 4, it's like it gets unbelievably heaviest with each person.
Yeah.
There was a 14-year-old boy who was found lying across the top of the man who was in 16C. He was found by firefighters 5.5 minutes after the aircraft had stopped. And he was alive, suffering only superficial burns to his hands. And he was the last of 27 survivors to escape through that overwing exit. And he was the last evacuee to survive the accident.
How did he get trapped?
He was just found lying across. He may have passed out.
Okay.
And he was found, 5.5 minutes later and only had superficial burns to his hands. Most of the 38 bodies were found clustered around this overwing exit because this exit was the first available to the 76 passengers seated behind it or even with it, and the nearest exit for 100 passengers. And you asked about those rear doors.
Yeah. Which I assume didn't go well because people are climbing.
Right. Actually, I'll get to that here in just a bit. So it's notable, although the number 4 stewardess initially had to keep passengers out of the galley while the purser was dealing with the doors. We're talking back again about L1 and R1 at the very front.
Yeah.
Once he had opened the L1 door, there was a logjam of passengers formed in the narrow aisle between the galley bulkheads, which she had to free by pulling passengers clear. If you think about it, like when you get on a plane, you walk in the door, you turn to your right to go to the seats. Mm-hmm. It's kind of narrow there.
Yeah.
Before you get into the aisle where the seats are. Well, back then it was even more narrow. They had to change the size of that galley because of this accident. Back then, that bulkhead opening was only 22.5 inches wide.
What?
It's really narrow, right?
Wait, 22.5 inches.
That's why
I don't even think there's some people who could fit through that.
Right.
I mean that not in a mean way.
Not that people. Yeah. Right. It's way too small.
That's like So you think about your waist, right? When people, that's like
that's a circumference.
Yeah,
though.
I know.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking like I feel like a lot of this narrowest part of a lot of bodies is like 10 to
probably more than that. I mean,
10. I would say 10 on the low side to like I don't know. I bet some people go up to 30s and 40s.
Yeah, I'm trying to guess for myself. I'm probably 18 inches wide. I don't know, but know,
I don't know.
And I'm a pretty thin person.
Yeah.
So. This bulkhead opening was 22.5 inches wide. So when people were going to evacuate, they were getting jammed in there. And one of the flight attendants was having to like unclog it, like pull people free.
Oh my God.
To like get the logjam cleared out. Because of this accident, now that opening, the size of it got increased to 30 inches. And in testing, they show, this greatly increases survivability.
Yeah.
Right. Because now people don't
bottleneck
get stuck
the
there.
emergency exits.
Right. One other side note, I didn't know where else to put this in the script. The other thing that people learned from this accident that got introduced was they added strip lighting to the floors to guide people to the exits. And they go over that now in every pre-flight. They're like, in the event of an emergency,
look at the ground and
floor lighting will show you where to go and where the exit is. Didn't exist back then. So from survivor statements, this jam, or remember the 22.5-inch opening, this occurred as passengers moved forward down the aisle while being pushed from behind, and they were jostling for position at the bulkheads with other passengers who had moved forwards over the seats. So there's this log jam of people crawling over the seats, coming down the aisle, trying to get through here, and the number 4 flight attendant is having to stop them to keep them there so that the purser can open the door to give him enough room to open the door. And then once the door is open, she's having to yank people through to clear that congestion to get people out the door.
I'm just trying to think about that door coming off its hinges or not having hinges. And I'm just I guess the benefit of that is you can put it wherever you need to put it. But
right. And it's not something that'll fail.
Yeah.
Imagine if we have those hinges like a pneumatic, and we're switching here. We're talking about the overwing exit now. If you have something think about a hood on a car with that pneumatic. Lots of times over time, that doesn't work anymore. Your hood will fall down. It's you got to get a rod to hold your hood up. Imagine if that happened on an emergency exit.
Yeah,
that'd be no good. Anyway, going back to the front doors here, L1 and R1. It's apparent that from the statements of the cabin crew that survivors tended to flow in groups to either one door or the other, probably because the aisle between the galley bulkheads effectively throttled the flow, restricting the exit rate to lessen the potential capacity of the 2 forward doors. So they weren't able to get enough people forward to evacuate. They could have been evacuating more.
To the front rear.
To the front. Yeah.
Front R.
If
whatever.
L1 and R1.
Yeah.
Correct.
Whatever that one is.
The forward cabin crew members reacted commendably and with courage, remaining on board until they were on the point of being overcome by smoke themselves and were being urged by firemen to get out. A number of survivors clearly owe their lives to the direct actions of the purser and the number 4 stewardess.
Cool.
Number 4 flight attendant, she actually kept going back in looking for people. And she found, I want to say she found one young girl who was disoriented in her seat and picked her up and carried her out and took her to the exit. Yeah, absolute hero. Going back in at her own, risk of her own life, just crawling on the floor, looking for anyone who was alive and, dragging them up to the front and getting them out of the plane.
And think about, again, going back to fire drills when you're a kid, and it's you're supposed to stop, drop, and roll.
If you're on fire.
But then also you get on the ground and crawl. And I remember that being instilled into me as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
One time, this is a tangent. One time when we were a kid, I think my mom wanted to start a fire in the winter or something, not on purpose, in the fireplace.
Okay. A good fire.
And she didn't open the chimney hatch.
Mm-hmm.
And then so there's just smoke everywhere in our house. And I remember screaming, everyone stop, drop, and roll. and then after I stopped and dropped and rolled, then I remember you
gotta crawl.
Army crawling
through
the house, because that's what I'd been trained to do.
And the reason is those toxic gases go up. So if you stay low, you'll be okay. So all of this we've talked about so far has been the front exits and the overwing exits. And I know earlier you asked about the rear exits are L2 and R2. So back there, it's the number 2 and number 3 flight attendants who sit at the back of the plane. And the report says they were placed in an extraordinarily difficult position. The extent of the external fire and its effects would have been known to them at an early stage, as with the discomfort and the alarm of the passengers in the rear of the aircraft, especially on the left-hand side.
Mm-hmm.
Not much is known of their actions. The first and only activity evident at the rear of the aircraft was the opening of the R2 door just before the aircraft stopped. And I mentioned this very briefly in reading a bunch of text earlier. So the plane was still rolling right before it stopped. That rear right door did open. This occurred very shortly after the commander's evacuation instruction and could have been either a very rapid response to that command or as a direct response to the deteriorating conditions in the rear of the cabin.
Yeah, they just started doing it.
Right. They just needed to start doing something to prep getting people out, because this is the part of the plane where it would have been the worst. During the latter stages of the abandoned takeoff, and just as the aircraft turned towards taxiway link Delta, the right rear R2 door was seen by external witnesses to be open with the slide deployed and inflated. A flight attendant was initially visible in the doorway, but the door and slide were obscured by thick black smoke as the aircraft stopped. No one escaped through this door.
Wow.
2 passengers remember seeing one of the 2 flight attendants from the rear of the aircraft struggling to direct passengers in the rear aisle, and neither rear flight attendant survived. So no one in the back of the plane made it out.
Oh, no.
They opened that R2 door even before they were stopped, and no one could even get to that door. That's how bad the smoke in the back of the plane was.
Wow.
If you look at a map of where passengers were seated and what door they escaped through and where the passengers perished.
That's what we should post on social media.
I will post that. It's a really interesting breakdown to look at. And I mean, there are a couple of people in the rear of the plane who do manage to get out, but it's really the bulk of the people who died in this accident were seated in the back of the plane because they were furthest from the usable exits, and that's where the smoke and fire was the worst.
It's so tragic that other door didn't open.
Mm-hmm. But even
then, I don't know if they would have made it all the way through. There's still a bottleneck of people not able to.
Right. They can't get people through fast enough to use those doors. From the total of 22 rows of seats in the cabin, there were only 5 survivors from seats aft of row 16. So from row 16 to 22, only 5 people survived, from where 29 passengers and 2 flight attendants perished. The rearmost and sole survivor in row 20 remembered a flight attendant in the aisle next to him, apparently trapped in a melee of passengers. And this was probably the number 2 flight attendant, whose evacuation task in other circumstances would have been to open the L2 door, but they couldn't open that door in this instance. So as all of this is going on, the purser, once he does open the L1 door and people begin going out to it, he actually turns his attention back to the R1 door, thinking, okay, now we have an exit for people to go out.
I'm going to try and get this other one.
Yeah, I need to try to get the other door open. And he does actually manage to open it.
Oh.
He has to really mess with it because, like I said, the slide started deploying. So he's got to get in there and try to unstick the slide from the door.
You say the slide as in the
evacuation slide.
He got stuck in the...
It started deploying before the door was open.
And that's how it got stuck.
Yeah, it was getting jammed.
So it was up against the plastic inflatable
correct.
stuff?
So he was having to get his hand, or I don't know what he actually used, but he was having to move the slide as it was trying to deploy out from the door, which was jamming it, and then push the door open. And he did actually manage to get the R1 door.
You say push the door open, but it's really pull it in.
Yeah, sorry. I said, yeah, you're right.
Right?
He did manage to open the door so that people could evacuate from there as well.
Sounds like there needs to be some design work on the slide.
Yeah, that needs to be, and that was revisited. So in total, 17 surviving passengers escaped through the L1 door, 34 escaped through the R1 door, and 27 through the overwing exit, including 1 infant and 1 child in arms. Members of the fire service who were on duty at the time, said that they heard a bang and saw an aircraft decelerating on runway 24, and black smoke and flames were trailing from the left side of the aircraft. And the firemen had already initiated their response when the crash alarm siren sounded. So even before the alarm went off, letting them know about it, they'd already seen it and were already getting ready and heading out there. 2 rapid intervention vehicles attended first, one arriving at the aircraft coincident with, and the other just after the L1 door had opened and its slide had deployed, as passengers were about to start evacuating. So they got out there very quickly. The fire service vehicles were positioned in order to attempt to keep the escape routes clear of fire and to attack the source of the fire. When the second fire engine arrived, the first concentrated on the burning jet fuel and the left engine. The second sprayed foam over the fuselage and the open door. That flight attendant I talked about, number 4 flight attendant, she said that when that door opened and when she started leading passengers to it, that there was just foam and water hitting them because the firefighters wanted to keep the fire from going in that door and to try to keep people cool as they were coming out from that door. And so at this time, this is when that number 4 flight attendant, her name's Joanna Toff, is now directing these people out the L1 door. And that's when the purser moves back to R1 to try to work on it and get it open. When the left side door, when L1 was opened, exiting passengers were all, like I said, were jammed between those 2 galley bulkheads. And Joanna Toff was having to pull the passengers out one at a time, clearing the jam, getting people out L1 while the purser was working on R1. He successfully opened the door about 1 minute after the plane had stopped.
And so this narrow passageway, that's the access point for both L1 and R1.
Right.
Mm.
To even get to the doors, people have to go through that.
So it's there's point. 2 doors to exit out of, but only room for 1 person to get through at a time.
Right.
Which is just...
Not great.
Not great, yeah.
But you think, in this situation, they should have been exiting only out of the right side. They shouldn't have been using the left door. So if they're only using 1 door, it's probably okay. But you're right. There's no reason not to increase the size to let more people out. 16 passengers and Toff escaped through the left front door, and one of whom was dragged out by Toff while unconscious, and the purser and 34 passengers made their escape out of the right front door. About 7 minutes after the aircraft stopped, it became clear no more passengers were likely to evacuate unaided, and firemen equipped with breathing apparatus entered through that R1 door. However, there was an explosion that occurred, which blew one of the firemen out of the door and onto the tarmac. And then after this, the officer in charge, became concerned about the limited amount of water remaining on the firefighting vehicles, ordered that no further attempts to enter the cabin should be made until reliable water supply was established.
In that explosion, did anyone die or get injured?
That's a good question. The report doesn't talk about that. I don't know. The only thing the report says is that fireman was blown out the door onto the tarmac, but there is no follow-up as to whether or not he was injured.
I would assume he didn't die because they would list it.
Right, and he's not listed as an injury in the write-up. So I'm going to say he was probably okay.
They have a bunch of protective gear on for that kind of thing.
Right. So, they wait for a bit, regroup, and then, re-enter with breathing apparatus. And then this is about 33 minutes after the aircraft had stopped. They find a male passenger who was alive but unconscious, lying in the aisle near the front of the aircraft. And he was the last person to be removed alive, but he ended up dying 6 days later in the hospital due to injuries in his lungs and the resulting pneumonia.
Oh, inhaled a lot of toxic stuff.
Right. Toxic smoke and fire caused the deaths of 53 passengers and 2 cabin crew, 48 of them from smoke inhalation. 78 passengers and 4 crew escaped, with 15 people sustaining serious injuries. We've already been talking for 45 minutes, and we haven't even really scratched the surface of the investigation. We've just been talking about
the evacuation,
which happened in just a couple of minutes, right? Like the entire thing was just seconds to minutes in occurring. Kick off spring with new gear built to last. Our friends at Shady Rays have you covered from the sun to the slopes with premium polarized shades, customizable snow goggles, and much more. Shady Rays is an independent sunglasses company that offers a world-class product that's just as good as any expensive pair I've ever worn. Plus, Shady Rays offers the most insane protection in all of eyewear. Every pair of sunglasses is backed by lost and broken replacements, so if you lose or break your pair even on day one, they'll send you a brand new pair, no questions asked. Shady Rays also provides 10 meals to fight hunger in America with every order and have donated over 20 million meals to date. So you can look good in your gear and feel good by making an impact. I keep Shady Rays in my bag, so I've got them ready anytime I'm out and about on the go. If it gets a little too bright, a little too sunny, bam, just slap them on. If you don't love them, you can exchange them for a new pair or return them for free within 30 days. There's no risk when you shop with Shady Rays. Their team always has your back. So just for our listeners, Shady Rays is giving out their best deal of the new year. Go to shadyrays.com. Use code BlackBoxDown for 50% off 2 or more pairs of polarized sunglasses. Try for yourself the shades rated 5 stars by over 200,000 people. Hey, in case you didn't know, April, it's Earth Month, and Green Chef is offering a collection of brand new limited time only recipes made with sustainable, earth-friendly ingredients throughout the end of April. The Earth Month recipes feature premium proteins, seasonal organic produce, and sustainably sourced seafood. They're also partnering with One Tree Planted to plant trees in northern Thailand to combat food insecurity in vulnerable communities. One tree will be planted for every box that's sold. I love Green Chef. I think it's great. I'm always excited whenever I get my meals during the week. I know it's stuff that I really like, stuff that I'm gonna like, and it's fun to put together, super quick, and you feel good when you're done with it, and you get to eat it. In case you didn't know, Green Chef is now owned by HelloFresh. With a wider array of meal plans to choose from, there really is something for everyone. Plus, as an added bonus, Green Chef is the only meal kit that offsets 100% of their carbon footprint, as well as 100% of the plastic in every box. With Green Chef, you're reducing your food waste by up to 23% versus grocery shopping, so you can eat well while celebrating Mother Earth this April. Right now, go to greenchef.com/blackboxdown60. Use code blackboxdown60 to get 60% off plus free shipping. That's greenchef.com/blackboxdown60 with code blackboxdown60 for 60% off and free shipping. The scary truth is that huge tech companies enrich themselves by making money off your personal data. They grab your web history, email metadata, and video searches to create a detailed profile on you, and then they sell that off to the highest bidder. To protect your identity and data from these tech giants, I recommend using ExpressVPN every time you go online. Just think about the websites you visit: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Google. Everything you do and say online is tracked when you browse on an unprotected network. Luckily, ExpressVPN makes you anonymous online by camouflaging your IP address and replacing it with a different secure IP of your choice. It also encrypts all your data, so it's protected from hackers and anyone else that's trying to spy on you. It's super easy to use. It's like one button. It covers every device I have: my laptop, my desktop, my phone, my tablet. Doesn't matter. I'm always protected, and it's just peace of mind knowing that there's no snooping, no eavesdropping going on. You can just change your IP address at will. So if you want your internet data to belong to you and not big tech companies that are going to profit off your personal data, then ExpressVPN is the answer. Protect your data with the #1 rated VPN provider today. Visit expressvpn.com/blackboxdown to get 3 months free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/blackboxdown. expressvpn.com/blackboxdown to learn more. So many of the factors which affected this accident should have been biased towards a favorable outcome. The cabin was initially intact. The aircraft remained mobile and controllable. No one had been injured during the abandoned takeoff.
It was on the ground.
Right. That's what we keep saying. It hadn't even gotten in the air. The volume of fuel involved, although capable of producing an extremely serious fire, was relatively small compared with the volume typically carried at takeoff. The accident occurred on a well-equipped major airport, and fire service was in attendance within 30 seconds of the aircraft stopping. But still, 55 people died. And the investigation identified the cause of all of this as engine failure. And the sequence of events which followed relating to the development of the fire and the evacuation were extremely complex, involving numerous interlocking factors, many of which critically affected survival. So, and all of this happened. We still haven't gotten to it. Why did the engine do that? Why did it have an uncontained failure? Why did a piece come out and start a fire? How did you even get to this point? And although much evidence was destroyed in the fire, and other evidence, especially that from survivors and rescue personnel, required careful interpretation, particularly concerning their assessment of timescale, it has been possible to construct a reasonably consistent picture of the fire in all its aspects. Statements from the survivors were highly descriptive and provided a rare insight into the evacuation problems encountered. And for the most part, conclusions derived from an analysis of the wreckage accorded well with those arrived at via witness testimony and from other sources. We always say eyewitnesses are unreliable, so they have to, compare everyone's statements and then compare all of those statements to the facts that they can see, from the wreckage. And they say they're able to piece together pretty well what happened. So dealing with the engine, there was an explosive failure of the combustion chamber outer case, and the damage to the adjoining tank access panel were clearly related events. Marks on the access panel fragments exactly matched the shape of the domed head of the separated number 9 combustor can and the fan case fragment, and a smear of panel material was identified on the dome, indicating beyond all doubt it was this which struck and shattered the panel. It is clearly evident the dome was ejected through the disrupted engine casing as a result of extremely rapid escape of high-pressure combustion air through the ruptured portion of the engine. This release of fuel from the damaged wing tank directly into combustion gases from the ruptured combustion chamber and its inevitable ignition changed the nature of the event from purely engine-related incident into a catastrophic event. Okay, that was a huge mouthful. So in the engine, there's these parts called combustor cans. And the combustor cans are parts where fuel and air are mixed together and ignited to create the thrust. And it turns out one of them, the number 9 combustor can, had, you can say, exploded. It had shattered.
Yeah.
And a part of it shot out from the engine and then hit the underside of the wing next to the engine.
Yeah.
But it turns out it didn't just hit like a random part of the underside of the wing. It hit an access panel on the underside of the wing. Like in case someone needs to open it up and take a look into the wing. It's not a very big panel. It's just like pure dumb luck. It hit this small weak spot on the bottom part of the wing.
That was
at the access panel.
More accessible and easier to break through.
Exactly.
And
ruptured
had important stuff.
And there was fuel in there and ignited that fuel. Well, the fuel started dripping out, which then hit the hot gases escaping out of the engine and ignited and started the fire.
It's just really bad luck.
Really bad luck.
And why it just exploded because...
Well, that's now the question.
Okay.
Why did it explode? That shouldn't happen. So this engine has 9 of these combustor cans inside of it. And this specific engine was delivered new to British Air Tours in April of 1980, fitted to a different aircraft. And then in the winter of 1983 to 1984, the engine was removed and stripped. And at that time, there was a light maintenance inspection performed, and the engine was reassembled with repaired combustor cans from another engine.
Oh.
This engine had been prematurely removed in September of 1983 due to a pilot report of high exhaust gas temperature and visible compressor damage. This engine was stripped, and it was found that a failure of the 13-stage compressor outer shroud had caused damage to the 13-stage compressor blades. Not terribly important for us. It's just there was a problem with another engine. They took parts from it, and one of those was the combustor can, which ended up here. And there is a huge section of this report that I'm going to summarize for you because it's all very technical. It deals a lot with metallurgy. And I know we actually have some listeners who are metallurgists. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting us. This is all way over my head. But the bulk of it is that I can summarize it by saying this. So this number 9 combustor can had a circumferential crack, that's a mouthful, of 160 millimeters.
Around the circumference of the, so like.
Exactly, around the outside portion. That was 160 millimeters in length. And there was the procedure at the time to fix that when there were cracks like that was to do a welding repair. And that was done during the light maintenance inspection.
They found that crack
and they
fixed
welded it. Right.
Presumably.
Right. Fixed it by what they did at the time, which was to re-weld it to fix the cracks. And this was a common fix for this kind of problem. That being said, this particular crack, the 160 millimeters, was longer than they typically fix. This was a particularly long crack. And
what percentage of the canister was that crack?
So this crack had multiple origins and multiple positions around the circumference of the number 9 can. And this can had exhibited 2 separate cracks centered on the 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock positions. So imagine a clock going from 11 to 2. That's quite a bit.
Yeah.
3 hours of a clock. Well, then there's 12 hours on the clock. So about 25%
and
of the
those
can.
You said it were centered.
Right.
Which means
it went out from there. And these had been repaired, but cracks at similar radial positions regrew in service and were joined by a third major crack centered on the 6 o'clock position. So it had cracks at the 11 and 2 at the top, and then a third crack started down at the 6 o'clock position.
And didn't you say that this engine was taken out of, or parts of it were removed into this one because the previous engine was like burning too hot or had too much exhaust or something?
The exhaust gas temperature was high. Yeah, but that was a separate issue that they were dealing with, having to do with the fan blade. Yeah, there were problems in general, we can say here. So there's cracks all over this combustor can that have gotten welded and fixed. But this is why, remember I said earlier that the number 1 engine was having slow acceleration. It's because this combustor can was not working quite right. It was already starting to fail, but there's no way to tell that without really getting in there and disassembling it.
How many in an engine?
9.
9. So 1/9 of the engine was not working.
Combusting properly, right. It's not a great analogy, but it would be like the cylinders in your car. Like if one cylinder isn't quite working as well as the other ones.
Yeah.
Not the best analogy, but it'll have to do.
Works for me. I don't know anything about cars.
So the cause of the accident was this uncontained failure of the left engine, initiated by a failure of the number 9 combustor can, which had already been the subject of a repair. A section of the combustor can, which was ejected forcibly from the engine, struck and fractured an underwing fuel tank access panel. The fire which resulted developed catastrophically primarily because of the adverse orientation of the parked aircraft relative to the wind, even though the wind was light. We talked about this. It turned the worst way possible. Major contributory factors were the vulnerability of the wing tank access panels to impact. Like we said, it hit a weak spot out of any place it could have impacted. It hit the access panel. A lack of any effective provision for fighting major fires inside the aircraft cabin, the vulnerability of the aircraft hull to external fire, and the extremely toxic nature of the emissions from the burning interior materials.
Sorry, I just thought it's like they're talking about the Death Star, and it's like it's not much bigger than a Womp Rat. Like,
yeah, I mean,
the access panels.
That's probably not a bad analogy. It's like, yeah, it's so. I'm sure that's what someone thought. It's so small. You know what harm could it cause? What possibly could happen?
Well, there might have been some farmer
Yeah.
on a desert planet who'd been bullseyeing Womp Rats his whole life.
Some Nerf herder.
Yeah.
That's all Star Wars. The major cause of the fatalities was a rapid incapacitation due to the inhalation of dense, toxic, and irritant smoke atmosphere within the cabin, aggravated by evacuation delays caused by a door malfunction and restricted access to the exit. So this is talking about what you were asking about earlier, like how do people die so quickly? It's like, it's this dense, toxic smoke. It's not necessarily that they're not getting oxygen, well, which they're not. It's more that they're getting this toxic gas,
poison gas,
into their systems.
Yeah, you think about it's weird because if you haven't been in a fire, which I haven't, not really. I don't count the
fireplace incident.
Yeah, the fireplace incident. You think like, well, you can breathe and like you breathe the smoke and it hurts and it's like gross, but it doesn't kill you, right? But this isn't that. None of us have probably ever been in this situation, right?
Right.
I mean, this is like
it's a confined space. And all you can breathe the smoke. There's no escaping. You could try to get low to the ground, and maybe you could, get some air, but it's still poison. that's entering your system.
You can't. And if you breathe it in, you go down.
Right. It'll incapacitate you. So, I'm going over all of the conclusions, and there are many, many conclusions in this report. But there's an important one here I want to highlight. It says the decision to turn the aircraft to the right into Link Delta, given the sequence and timing of information available to the commander. In particular, the initial lack of a fire warning was understandable. So it's like they're not blaming the pilots for exiting and making that right turn because they didn't have all of the information. They didn't know what was going on necessarily.
Yeah.
So it's like this was an understandable thing to do.
Yeah.
They don't have culpability in this. But that being said, the next conclusion is Turning the aircraft to the right had a critical effect on the fire, placing it upwind of the fuselage. So even though it was understandable, it still really led to a lot of these problems. The report also does give some praise to that purser, saying the purser showed initiative under pressure in opening the left forward door and then returning to the right forward door and clearing the jam. He didn't become overwhelmed with panic. It was like, okay, we got this going. Let's get the other one working too.
Yeah.
So then there are also some points here about the engine, about the combustor can. It says the manufacturer had advised operators that direct fusion weld repaired cans have lower fatigue lives than ones repaired using material replacement techniques, but had not quantified this reduction. British Airways interpreted this as applicable to cans with a much greater time in service than any operated at the time. So they knew that there was potential problems with welding this and it would reduce the lifespan, but they didn't give an exact number saying how much or when things should be replaced.
Yeah, or how big the cracks. There was no, I don't know, rules to follow, right? They were just like, hey, it's not going to work as well, but
you still do it.
Yeah.
And in fact, that kind of plays into the next conclusion on here. Whilst direct fusion weld repairs appear to have proved a worthwhile method for many operators, some did not employ this technique for circumferential cracks, the cracks that go all the way around. A large proportion of operators who did had self-imposed circumferential crack length limits in the region of 3 inches. So they knew they could only go up to a certain size. And again, this wasn't a rule from the manufacturer.
This is just like, we're going to make these rules because we think it's safe. Right.
Right.
But it shouldn't be up to you.
Right. So even then the operators.
Yeah. Because if capitalism has taught me anything, it's that's why there are regulations and safety things because
But I do want to, so this is talking about inches. I do want to put this into context. So they said a large portion of operators who did this, they had self-imposed their own limits on these types of cracks to 3 inches. We said that this number 9 combustor can had a 160 millimeter crack on it. That's about 6.3 inches.
Oh,
so this was a huge crack compared to what most other operators
wouldn't even try to attempt.
Right. They would be like, that's way too big of a crack. We're not going to do that.
And it was fixed, what, like you said, a year before?
Well, they had also done some remedying on it the day before. Because remember I said that the left engine was accelerating more slowly. So this had been an ongoing issue that they had been working on for some time.
So they kept just
like repatching it. Right. Trying to get.
And they've done it the day before.
So the report doesn't say, or I shouldn't say that. I was not able to see what action they took the day before. All it said was there was remedial action taken the day before.
On the canister.
On that engine. So presumably the canister, because the canister was the source of the slow acceleration.
And they know that canister was the source of the slow acceleration, or is that now after the fact?
That's after the fact. They're able to determine that. And in fact, your question, it plays into one of the next conclusions here. Remember, the engine was manufactured by Pratt & Whitney. It says, the Pratt & Whitney maintenance manual gave no guidance for troubleshooting an engine with low idle RPM. British Airways regarded the low idle as the prime reason for the slow acceleration of the number 1 engine, also reported by the crew on the 21st of August. None of the Pratt & Whitney communications referred to low idle as a symptom of a disrupted can. So even in the manufacturer's provided troubleshooting, it didn't say a disrupted can could be the cause of this. But now after the fact, they say, well, it was clearly the disrupted can that was causing all of this to happen.
But they didn't know, the people who were working on it, because it didn't say it.
Right. And it wasn't in the information provided by the manufacturer. So and I want to go back a little bit here and touch on something I mentioned earlier. I said, that the thrust reversers had deployed when they were slowing down when they aborted the takeoff, and the right thrust reverser closed and retracted, but the left reverser stayed open because the oil pressure had fallen and the left engine wasn't working anymore. The investigators for a while had a theory that maybe since that left engine thrust reverser was open, that it had been redirecting the fire back onto the fuselage. If the fire was shooting out of the engine, maybe it was hitting the thrust reverser, and instead of reversing thrust, it was reversing fire back onto the plane.
Oh my.
They did extensive testing on it, and they determined that was not the case.
Okay. That's wild.
Yeah, that would be awful to think about.
A flamethrower.
Yeah, exactly. But they said that by that point, no, there was no like fire shooting out of the engine. That did not happen. I just thought that was an interesting thing because we talk about what they find. We don't talk about like all the different avenues they go down and like all the different possibilities that they have to go through.
I'm thinking about them at the office. They have their whiteboard. All right, Tom, take off your flamethrower theory.
Yeah, get that out of here. I told you that was junk. So we talked about this ejected dome from the number 9 combustor can and how it hit the fuel tank access panel. And it created a hole which had an area of 42 square inches. So that'd be like 7 inches by 6 inches, roughly.
And that's the size of the canister, right?
Um,
Or the whole the top of it?
Well,
Or
probably. It probably got a
roughly?
little bigger. It probably punched through. The hole probably became a little bigger. And remember, I said it hit the wing tank access panel. And that panel had an impact strength approximately 1/4 that of the lower wing skin. Had the dome struck the adjacent skin, penetration of the tank probably would not have occurred.
God, it's that one bomb rat sized.
Neither the access panel nor the lower wing skin were designed to any impact resistance criteria, nor were they required to be. But if it had just moved a little to the left, any direction.
Yeah, but you don't really get to pick and choose where things explode.
Right. But it's like, it was such a precise location.
It's a precise malfunction.
Yeah. The initial, then this one kind of also is an important one. The initial fire penetration of the fuselage occurred within 20 seconds of the aircraft stopping, when the lower skin panels on the left side adjacent to the aft cargo hold were burnt through, followed shortly afterwards by penetration of the fiberglass acoustic insulation blanket. This gave the fire access to a cavity surrounding the cargo hold, from which it entered the aft cabin via floor-level air conditioning grills located on each side of the aircraft. So the fire kind of got around into the cargo hold, and we both talked about, when there's toxic gases, you get low to the ground, but the toxic gases were entering via the floor-level air conditioning.
Oh.
So even if you
before the fire was there, the smoke.
Right. It was already coming in, which is why it was largely not survivable back there, which is why so many people died there.
Yeah, I guess you think about it normally. You think about, well, there's fire in the cabin and that creates smoke.
Mm-hmm.
But there was fire other places and the smoke was all going into the cabin.
Correct.
And so even the fire that made it to the cabin, at that point, there was just so much smoke.
Exactly. I thought this was another interesting tidbit here. It said approximately 50% of the seats suffered little or no fire damage, and many plastic safety instruction cards, magazines, and other fragile items survived undamaged in the seat back pockets and on seat cushions. In contrast, all ceiling panels and overhead lockers were destroyed, and all side liner panels above cushion level were extensively damaged by fire. I saw the investigator said that you could have taken out like those safety cards from the plane, it's like wiped the soot off of them and just reused them still. Like they were so undamaged. Like there were so many things in the plane that were undamaged that could have just been wiped off and reused.
Yeah, and that's because the fire wasn't as much in the plane. It was more the smoke.
Right, it was the smoke that was traveling up. And that actually plays into the next point. A marked stratification of both temperature and smoke was evident throughout the cabin. In areas not actually combusting, there was comparatively little heat or smoke below a level of approximately 18 inches above the cabin floor. So from the floor to 18 inches up was relatively untouched.
Wow.
So that's actually very important to note. If you need to crawl and get out, like get really low. Like 18 inches from the ground is unbelievably low.
Yeah.
Like you need to, like you said, like Army man crawl to get out of there, to be within that 18 inches.
That is, 18 inches. And it's tough though, because where are you going to crawl in that incident where people are being trampled?
Right. Then there's people, or they're falling over on you, and
yeah, there's not really Army man.
There's not space.
Yeah. There's no Army crawling in that instance. It's like,
right. You line up.
You almost have to like go down, take a breath, and then come up or something. I don't know.
How do you get your nose 18 inches from the ground? Like if I was standing,
I don't know. I got a bigger nose than you guys,
and I had to do that. That seems tough. The next two points here are kind of tie into each other. The accident has highlighted a general ignorance of the importance of light winds within the aviation community at large.
Yeah.
Operational procedures in widespread use at the time of the accident made little or no allowance of practical value for such winds and provided minimal guidance to aircrew. So the next one, procedures should be devised to enable aircrew to position the aircraft most beneficially against the wind in the event of a ground fire.
Yeah, which is
that's what you want to hear. That's, I think, the biggest takeaway here is like if they had just turned the other direction, it would have gone so differently.
They didn't know, right.
Who would have known?
The only thing I like I said is I thought about wind, but it was like more about like stopping movement, not the wind itself.
Right.
I bet the movement actually was keeping the fire at bay in some respect.
Right. Because it's like
it was going against the wind and away from the plane.
Right. The primary reason for the majority of the fatalities was rapid incapacitation due to the inhalation of toxic smoke atmosphere, the effects of which were made more critical by evacuation delays. Of the 54 fatalities on board, 48 had absorbed levels of carbon monoxide and or hydrogen cyanide in excess of that required to induce incapacitation. So again, just toxic gases.
Gas.
all of that boils down. I'm just going to read the final paragraphs here, what they distill as the cause. And we've already kind of gone over it. I just want to read like officially what they write. The cause of the accident was an uncontained failure of the left engine initiated by a failure of the number 9 combustor can, which had been the subject of a repair. A section of the combustor can, which was ejected forcibly from the engine, struck and fractured an underwing fuel tank access panel. The fire, which resulted, developed catastrophically primarily because of the adverse orientation of the parked aircraft relative to the wind, even though the wind was light. Major contributory factors were the vulnerability of the wing tank access panels to impact, a lack of any effective provision for fighting major fires inside the aircraft cabin, the vulnerability of the aircraft hull to external fire, and the extremely toxic nature of the emissions from the burning interior materials. The major cause of fatalities was rapid incapacitation due to the inhalation of dense toxic irritant smoke atmosphere within the cabin, aggravated by evacuation delays caused by a forward right door malfunction and restricted access to the exits. So I feel like normally at the end we recap the things that have been learned, but I feel like we've been doing that already throughout this entire episode because there were so many lessons learned from this when it came to dealing with, even things as mundane as briefing the passengers who are seated in the exit row.
Yeah, and these are all things we take for granted too.
Right.
Because we deal with them as passengers.
Yeah.
All the time. Everyone deals with these things.
Right. How the exit is lined up with the row instead of over the seat.
Yeah, this is probably why exit seats are so big.
Right. Having more space for them. Even the entrance coming into the plane, the galley, got widened from 22.5 inches to 30 inches. There's like the exit lighting on the ground. So if you're army crawling 18 inches from the ground, you don't have to look up to see where the exits are. The lights turned red. There's an exit here.
Yeah.
Like all of these little things that really increase survivability. We're nearing the end here. There's something I want to wrap up and talk about. This particular accident, this British Air Tours flight, was August 22nd, 1985.
Mm-hmm.
This was the 4th disaster in 1985. This was a bad year for aviation. In June of 1985, there was an Air India 747 that was bombed. We did an episode about that.
Is that the one where the terrorists were trying to go to Australia or something?
No, that was Ethiopia. This is the one where it was the man in Vancouver said he was doing it on behalf of all the Sikhs and was flying, and it exploded off the coast of Ireland.
That was the one where that's why you can't put bags and then not get on a plane.
Right, exactly. That was that one. So that happened in June of 1985. Then later, or several weeks later, there was a Delta flight that crashed at Dallas-Fort Worth due to a microburst. We covered that one too.
Oh, yeah. It's like in a storm where the wind can it
increases, then shoots you down, then gives you a tailwind. Then 10 days before this accident was our second episode where the Japan Airline 747 decompressed.
And that one was huge. That was the big most deaths.
Right. The single deadliest plane crash. Tenerife was the deadliest because it involved 2 planes. And we covered all of those. In 1985 is the second deadliest year in commercial aviation.
Wow.
But that being said, August 1985, which is when this crash, or not crash, this accident happened, was the deadliest month ever in commercial aviation.
Holy moly.
Because that Air India one I mentioned was in June, but all those other accidents, the Delta crash, the JAL crash, and this one were all in August of 1985. Can you imagine today if there were 3 major accidents where people died on airplanes?
Like that many people. Yeah.
Right. We're talking,
that's crazy.
Between all 3 of them, probably like 1,000, close to 1,000 people. Well, not quite. It would be like, let's say like 800 people die in 1 month on plane crashes.
3 different incidents.
Right. You'd be like, I'm never getting on a plane. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But all of these were so influential to creating the safety culture we take for granted now.
Yeah. I wonder if this was like, in a way, the most influential year for safety.
It may have been.
And because a lot of these things that we're talking about are not safety things for like how the engine works, but a lot of it was about how people work and how we deal with passengers and like getting them on and off the plane. And then what we were talking about was the suitcase and letting people check suitcases. And it's like, yeah.
It's really mind-blowing to me that it could have been, that it was this dangerous for a while.
What was the most dangerous year?
The most dangerous year was 1972. It had 55 crashes in total in 1972, so more than one a week. And 1972, one of those crashes was the one that the movie Alive was based on, where the people crashed in the mountains in South America and then had to resort to cannibalism to survive. That was 1972. Worst year. 1985 was right behind it.
Hopefully, we've capped
Yeah, that's it. We don't ever want to go back. Never again.
Yeah, it's not a record you want to break.
No. But yeah, this is definitely like an inflection point where everything started. I think safety became like top of mind for everyone. Like we need to fix something. Otherwise, nobody's going to want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's it for British Air Tours Flight 28M. Just really, really dense episode considering the plane never even left the ground.
Yeah.
There were so many things going on. This is one of our longest episodes ever, if not our longest episode ever.
How long have you been recording?
We're recording about an hour, 24 minutes so far.
Wow.
And I cut a lot out. This was a super long script. Big thank you to Marcos who wrote this script. This was so much to parse through and try to distill down into a typical episode. But yeah, that's it. We'll be back next week with another episode.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.